Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hi, and welcome everyone. My name is Sandi Safro, and I'm going to be your host for today's episode of Hydrogen Rising, where we'll be taking a closer look at hydrogen exports. As many of our listeners may already be aware, there are several potential methods for exporting hydrogen, including using compressed hydrogen, exporting via ammonia, using liquid organic hydrogen carriers, and exporting hydrogen in liquid form as LH2. Today, we're going to focus in particular on takeaways and possible lessons learned for LH2 from LNG. For context, for those who are not familiar, LNG is liquefied natural gas. It's the same natural gas that flows into our homes for use in our cooktops and our fireplaces, but it's just super cooled. It's cooled to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 160 degrees Celsius. And at that temperature, natural gas becomes a liquid. The important thing about that is in its liquid state, natural gas takes up 1/600th of the amount of space that it takes up in its gaseous state, which is a huge economy of scale and hence the preference for using liquefaction in exports. Similarly, in order to turn hydrogen into a liquid, it also has to be supercooled. And for hydrogen, it is a much lower temperature. It's negative 423 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 253 degrees Celsius. This much cooler temperature relative to LNG requires more energy to produce, which we'll talk about more in today's episode. In its liquid state, hydrogen, like LNG, takes up a significantly less amount of space or lower amount of space than it does in its gaseous state. For hydrogen, it's actually 1/800th of the amount of space that it occupies in its gaseous state. Liquefaction and super cooled liquid products, though, are not without their challenges, and LNG has run the gauntlet on some of those obstacles already, and we're going to talk about some of those today and how they may map over into the LH2 space. So to help me dig deeper into hydrogen exports and the LNG LH2 connection, I'm joined today by two of my colleagues from our Australia offices. We have Josh Spry from our Perth office, whose voice may sound familiar to many of you as he's kindly lent it to us for our intro and outro for the podcast. And we also have Clive Cachia from our Sydney office. It is particularly appropriate having you both on for this topic, not only because you co-authored a recent Bloomberg article on point, which our listeners can find a link to on the K&L Gates website, but also because of Australia's significant role as an energy exporter. And more specifically, Australia has been a global leader in LNG exports, and particularly so in the Asia-Pacific region. The LNG industry is one that's been around for decades, but it certainly did not evolve into a global economy overnight. So as we'll talk more about today, and as I mentioned, there are a number of areas of potential similarity for hydrogen exports, but also several areas of potential divergence. So shifting gears a little bit, in episode 3, we talked a bit about the potential for the development of an Asia-Pacific hydrogen economy and touched on Australia's possible role. To start us off, Clive, I'd be curious if you can talk about what role you see Australia looking to play in the hydrogen space and examples of concrete steps that you see Australia taking towards realizing that vision.
Thanks, Sandy, and hello to all the listeners. So you're absolutely right. Australia is in a sweet spot as it has abundant feedstock for all forms of hydrogen production, be it renewables for electricity to produce green hydrogen or fossil fuels to produce that electricity or for use in the production of blue or grey hydrogen. It also has strong existing trade links in all forms of commodities, and it has a proven track record in industrialising commodity production, particularly in recent times with respect to LNG. And it's safe to say that Australia will look to leverage these existing comparative advantages to become a leading hydrogen-based energy exporter. So its stated strategy to do this will be to remove and overcome export market barriers, to efficiently build supply and demand for hydrogen use in various uses such as transport, heat and grid electricity, and to also augment its current mature use as an industrial feedstock, be it in oil refining or ammonia production. Additionally, the strategy will also seek to accelerate our global cost competitiveness in order to scale up quickly our hydrogen production and distribution as markets develop. So a key tactic within this strategy will be to create clusters of large-scale demand. These are known as hydrogen hubs at ports, cities, or regional areas throughout Australia, and they'll be co-located with existing critical infrastructure and co-utilised with other existing commodities supply chains. Now, the idea is that these hubs will make infrastructure upgrades more cost-efficient and foster innovation and synergies in energy production and delivery for both domestic use and for exports. So far, over 30 locations for such hubs have been identified, and a number of pilot projects are being developed over the next few years to demonstrate the viability of these projects to encourage private sector investment. The opportunities here have been recognised by all levels of Australian governments, be it at the Commonwealth level or state or territory level, and each of them have their own roadmaps and incentive plans. And as mentioned earlier, that was the subject of an earlier podcast, so you can find that on our website. As an example of the dynamic nature of this government support, even since that episode has dropped, the National Energy Resources Australia, or NERA, a few days ago announced that we'll be investing $1.85 million in 13 regional hydrogen clusters across Australia to develop Australia as a globally recognised brand for hydrogen, and also to foster the technology, the skills and the collaboration required for hydrogen development.
That's great. Thanks, Clive. I guess kind of building off of that, in terms of markets, where do you see Australia looking to take a leading role? And do you think we're looking at an overlap with the way that Australia currently plays in the LNG markets?
Yeah, absolutely. As with Australia's enviable market position in LNG, there will be a focus on supplying East Asian markets in particular. Australia's population is such that domestic demand just cannot simply solely support the long-term and costly production and infrastructure project development, so export revenues will be needed to underwrite that expenditure. However, it's important here to distinguish between the short-term and the longer-term trends. In the long term, the clear goal is to penetrate the lucrative East Asian energy markets. However, in the short term, establishing a viable domestic market, for example, by blending hydrogen into existing gas networks or demonstrating its ability as a transport fuel, will lay the foundation for improved production economics, foster the all-important private capital networks, and develop the holistic supply chains from production to end use. And government support will be critical in this stage. And as I mentioned, various governments have already set the frameworks for that support. So that's the model that was used in the infancy of Australia's journey to becoming a leading global LNG exporter. And it provides an effective roadmap for Australia's positioning in the burgeoning hydrogen sector.
That's really interesting, and it's really exciting, I think, to see developments not just off on the horizon for hydrogen, but also concrete steps that are being taken in kind of much closer time to where we are right now. So just to shift gears a bit from those goals to how we're going to start seeing hydrogen exports develop and thinking about some of the possible ties to the LNG space. When you see an ocean-going LNG vessel, it's really hard not to be impressed by the size of the carrier. We're talking about standard vessel sizes with cargo capacities in the 125,000 to 175,000 cubic meter range, and typical lengths around 300 meters or 975 feet, going all the way up to vessel cargo capacities of 266,000 cubic meters and lengths of 345 meters for the Q-Max vessels, which is Qatar's biggest LNG carrier. Josh, I know you do a lot of work in the LNG space, and we've been having some conversations around LH2 vessel sizes. How do the LH2 vessel sizes compare to what we see in the LNG space?
Thanks, Sandy. LH2 vessels are currently a lot smaller than the LNG vessels that we're used to seeing. It's unlikely that we're going to see them at the same size, at least for a little while yet. Kawasaki Heavy Industries are building the world's first LH2 vessel. It's called the Suiso Frontier, and it's going to be closer to 100 meters long and less than 1% of the cargo capacity. We're talking, around 1,000 cubic meters rather than the hundreds of thousands of cubic meters for LNG vessels. This is very much a pilot vessel, though. It's part of a project that was discussed on an earlier podcast episode called the Hydrogen Energy Supply Chain. That's a project between Australia, Japan, and a range of Australian and Japanese companies that will produce hydrogen in Victoria, liquefy it, ship it to Japan, and then use it in Japan. The idea of this part of the project is to test and de-risk some of the technological changes that are required when you go from LNG to LH2. Kawasaki has a long history of building LNG carriers, so they're leveraging all of that experience in doing this work. But while there's a lot of crossovers between the two products, there's also some areas where changes are going to be required. The technology related, for example, the insulation needs to be significantly improved for LH2. It needs to stay at minus 250, as we've said, to stay as a liquid, as opposed to minus 160 degrees Celsius for LNG. That needs to be designed and tested. Some of the other changes are safety related. There was significant work done in the LNG space, in the early years to test flammability of liquid pools and gas leaks to make sure that they were safe. And there's calls for similar work to be done to show that LH2 can be managed just as safely, given it has a much wider flammability range.
Oh, that's really interesting. I just want to pick up on the point that you made about insulation for LH2. Boil off is a significant issue for LNG, and I'm curious how that issue compares in scope for LH2 and what you think it might mean for project economics in the hydrogen space.
So boil-off's managed a few ways in the LNG industry. First off, in trying to avoid it, it's achieved by insulating the tanks, trying to minimise heat transfer. To the extent that it can't be avoided, modern LNG tankers will try and either make use of the boiled off gas as a fuel, maybe to power the ship's engines or onboard systems, or they might even install small liquefaction plants on the vessels themselves to turn it back into LNG that can be delivered. We'd expect similar principles to apply to LH2, but the 100-degree Celsius drop in boiling point does create some challenges. As an example, boil off for modern LNG equipment, it's in the order of 0.2% per day. At a very simplistic level, looking at a 10-day voyage, the LNG carrier will turn up with about 98% of its product still in liquid form. But use exactly the same equipment, tanks, insulation, etc. for an LH2 carrier, and analysis suggests that the boil-off would be in the order of 5% per day. So suddenly that same 10-day voyage means that you've only got 60% liquid left when you turn up at the discharge terminal. And that's clearly not manageable, whether at a technical level or at a project economics level.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that certainly sounds like a pretty significant obstacle, and those are figures that definitely leave an impression. What are you seeing and hearing in terms of ways that the hydrogen industry might look to solve for the boil-off issue?
So we're aware of a number of proposed solutions for dealing with the increased boil-off challenges for LH2. The Kawasaki project is looking at ways to increase insulation efficiency, and they're doing this by adding a layer of vacuum insulation around the LH2 tank, effectively a tank within a tank with a vacuum layer in between to try and prevent heat transfer. This technology has only been used, in very small scales so far, 1,000 cubic meter range, and it's never been used on a ship. So there's a number of engineering challenges that need to be overcome and proved up. That said, if the pilot project is successful, we may see Kawasaki begin to scale up the technologies that larger volumes can be transported by ship. Another solution that's being explored is pressurized LH2 storage, where special reinforced tanks used that can tolerate significantly higher tank pressures, would say 5 or 10 bar instead of 1 bar. Basically, instead of the heat being released, for want of a better word, as boil-off gas, it's stored in the liquid and the tank becomes increasingly pressurized. We don't know too much about the timelines for this one, though. It'd be an interesting solution for keeping the product in liquid form until delivery.
That's really interesting. I can't wait to see what the developments are in that space. I have one other question for you, Josh, and I almost hesitate to ask it because I think we could probably spend several podcast episodes talking about it. But I'm curious, what are just a few of the examples of commercial terms that you see emerging for LH2 that are either reminiscent of LNG or strongly divergent from LNG, and why?
Okay, you're right. There's a lot that we could cover here, but let's pick a few examples. Maybe if we start with contracting and supply chain. I think like LNG projects, especially the early LNG projects, we expect that LH2 projects are going to need to be underpinned by long-term offtake contracts with minimum take or pay volumes. These will help get investors and lenders comfortable that the project revenues can pay back the substantial capex costs of developing and building, the LH2 supply chain. Similarly, we'd expect that projects will want to have a pretty clear picture of the whole export supply chain before they'll make their final investment decisions. Again, the focus here is on making sure that money will flow back through the system long term to pay off those upfront capex costs. Okay, so what about pricing? Pricing's challenging at the moment. There's a pretty sizable gap between buyers and sellers. Buyers don't want to pay more than the cost of their competing fuels in their local market. This might be coal, diesel, LNG, depending on what the target industry is. But those prices are very challenging to achieve at the moment for sellers. They're more likely to be wanting to sell on a cost-plus basis to make sure that they're always kept whole. There's external factors that might help to bridge this gap, things like increased carbon taxes in the destination market. They'll bring up the cost of competing fuels and make that gap a bit smaller. We might see government grants, to reduce capex costs for the production facilities or the transport, or maybe incentives from government to absorb some of the hydrogen price. At the moment, these haven't been developed yet. So it's a bit of a wait and see, I think, for the time being, to see what develops exactly for the first export projects. We may well see mechanisms like alternative index pricing, linking to oil or other commodities, maybe price review mechanisms, which are commonplace in the LNG industry, and see them being adapted for hydrogen contracts as well. Another feature of LNG contracts is how they deal with cover. This is where a party fails to deliver or fails to receive the LNG that they're supposed to take. Modern LNG contracts will frequently manage this scenario by requiring the other party to source alternative supply from the market in the case of a supply failure, or requiring the party to try and sell the cargo in the market in the case of a receipt failure. Take or pay arrangements will continue to apply in the background, but the idea is to try and keep volumes moving and minimise take-or-pay damages. Now, this structure probably isn't going to work straight out of the box for LH2, though, and there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, there'll be a reduced pool of alternative buyers and sellers. There's just not going to be that open market. Similarly, there'll be reduced numbers of unloading facilities, alternative liquefaction facilities to buy and receive the LH2 from. Add to that different projects might use a different transport solution. We've already talked about pressurised versus unpressurised liquid H2, compressed hydrogen, ammonia, and things get even more complicated. So producers and buyers will need to give some careful thought, both at a contracting level and at a commercial level, to make sure that their cover structure works and that it's practical, in the early stage LH2 market. Maybe a final example of analogues to the LNG industry is scheduling. So we talked a bit about vessel sizes earlier for LH2. On top of those, smaller sizes so far, LH2 only contains about 40% of the energy content that the same volume of LNG contains. So even assuming that we can match vessel sizes in the future, this difference in energy density means that we still need about 2.5 times as many ships carrying the same energy content from production country to destination markets. So the scheduling matters that are already pretty complicated for LNG, things like berth constraints, inventory management, delivery programs, 90-day schedules. That's going to take on an even greater level of importance with LH2.
That's great. That's certainly a lot of things to think about. And I know that's only scratching the surface of the list that you probably could have ticked through. I guess we'll kind of leave it there because I think we're probably at our normal time for our podcast. And I want to thank you both for joining me today to help scratch the surface on hydrogen exports. Thank you also to our listeners for joining us. If you have questions about any of the topics that we talked about in today's episode, please don't hesitate to reach out. And of course, stay tuned for our next episode of Hydrogen Rising, which will be coming your way in just 2 weeks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.